The sun hung like a brass medallion over the Nevada Territory, casting long shadows across the alkali flats when Jack Cordell first heard the sound that would change everything. It wasn't the familiar crack of his Winchester or the whistle of wind through sagebrush. It was something far more troubling. A woman's cry, weak and desperate, carried on the desert air like a prayer nobody wanted to answer. Cordell reined in his bay gelding and tilted his weathered hat back, squinting toward a cluster of Joshua trees about a quarter-mile south. The cry came again, fainter this time, and he felt that familiar tightening in his chest, the same feeling he'd gotten before every gunfight, every moment when a man's character got measured against his comfort. At 43, Jack Cordell had earned his reputation the hard way. 3 years riding shotgun for Wells Fargo, 2 more as a town marshal in places where decent folks feared to tread, and enough gunfights to know that mercy was often a luxury a man couldn't afford. His Colt 45 had never failed him, and his aim had kept him breathing when lesser men had found their final rest in Boot Hill graveyards from California to Colorado. But mercy, he'd learned, had a way of finding a man when he least expected it. He spurred his horse toward the sound, his hand instinctively checking the position of his sidearm. The desert had taught him that anything unexpected usually meant trouble, and trouble in this God-forsaken stretch of Nevada could take 100 different forms: rattlers, claim jumpers, renegade Apaches, or worse. What he found was a young Paiute woman, maybe 20 summers old, collapsed beside a salt cedar thicket. Blood soaked through her doe-skin dress, and her breathing came in shallow, ragged gasps. She'd been shot, probably from a good distance, and whoever had done it had left her to die like a wounded animal. Cordell dismounted and approached slowly, his hands visible and empty. The woman's dark eyes tracked his movement, alert despite her condition. There was no fear in those eyes, only a fierce determination that reminded him of a cornered wildcat. "Easy now," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl he'd picked up during his years in Texas. "I ain't gonna hurt you, miss." She tried to speak, but only managed a whisper in her native tongue. Cordell didn't need a translation to understand. She was asking him not to leave her there to die. He'd seen enough bullet wounds to know this one was serious but not necessarily fatal. The shot had taken her high in the shoulder, missing the vital organs but tearing through muscle and sinew. Without proper care, infection would kill her within days. With it, she might live to see another season. Cordell had learned enough Paiute during his travels to attempt basic communication. "Who did this?" he asked, mixing English with the few words he knew of her language.
She managed to point northwest toward the silver camps and mining claims that dotted the territory like infected sores. Her hand shook as she formed the word soldiers. That complicated things considerably. The army had been having troubles with the Paiute tribes lately, mostly over water rights and the constant encroachment of miners onto traditional hunting grounds. If soldiers had shot this woman, it could mean she was part of a raiding party, or it could mean she was simply in the wrong place when nervous recruits started shooting at shadows. Cordell made his decision the way he always did, quickly and without looking back. He gathered the woman in his arms, surprised by how light she was, and lifted her onto his horse. She winced but didn't cry out, proving she had more backbone than most men he'd known. His ranch was 15 miles south, a modest spread he'd built with his own hands and the money he'd saved from his years wearing a badge. It wasn't much, a 3-room cabin, a barn, and enough grazing land for a small herd. But it was his, and more importantly, it was defensible. The ride took the better part of 2 hours, with Cordell stopping frequently to check on his passenger. Each time, those fierce dark eyes met his, and he saw something there that unsettled him. It wasn't gratitude, it was assessment. This woman was measuring him, trying to figure out what kind of man would risk his neck for a stranger, especially one whose people were considered enemies by most whites in the territory. By the time they reached his ranch, the woman had lost consciousness. Cordell carried her into his cabin and laid her on his own bed, then set about the grim business of treating a gunshot wound. He'd done it before, on himself and others, and his hands stayed steady as he cleaned the wound and extracted fragments of fabric driven deep by the bullet's impact. She came around as he was bandaging her shoulder, and the first thing she did was reach for a knife that wasn't there. Cordell had already removed it, along with a small pouch of what looked like pemmican and a few personal items. "You're safe here," he told her, meeting her eyes directly. "Name's Jack Cordell. This is my place." She studied his face for a long moment before speaking. Her English was better than his Paiute, colored with the precise pronunciation of someone who had learned it as a second language. "Why?" she asked, simply. It was a fair question, and one he'd been asking himself during the long ride home. Why risk trouble with the army? Why invite the complications that would surely follow? Why care about the fate of one wounded woman when the desert claims lives every day? "Because it was the right thing," he said finally. She considered this answer, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not trust exactly, but a willingness to reserve judgment. "I am Ayanna," she said, "daughter of Chief Winnemucca of the Northern Paiute." Cordell felt his blood cool.
Winnemucca was no small-time chief. He commanded the respect of dozens of bands scattered across Nevada and California. More importantly, he was known to be a fierce protector of his people, with little patience for whites who treated the Paiute as less than human. "Your father know where you are?" Cordell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Ayanna's eyes clouded with something that might have been regret or fear. "I was gathering medicine plants near Walker Lake when the soldiers came. They said I was scouting for raiders." "Were you?" The question hung between them like smoke from a campfire. Ayanna met his gaze without flinching. "My people are hungry," she said. "The miners take our water. The ranchers drive their cattle through our hunting grounds. The army builds forts on our sacred places. What would you do, Jack Cordell?" It was an honest answer, and it told him everything he needed to know. This woman wasn't some innocent caught in the crossfire. She was a daughter of a chief, raised to understand the political currents that flowed between peoples. Whether she'd been scouting or not, her presence near the mining camps had been no accident. As evening settled over the ranch, Cordell prepared a simple meal of beans and hardtack while Ayanna rested. The mundane task of cooking gave him time to think, and what he thought about wasn't encouraging. If Ayanna was truly Winnemucca's daughter, her disappearance would not go unnoticed. The chief would send search parties, and when they failed to find her, he would assume the worst. The worst being that the whites had killed her. Cordell was ladling beans into a tin plate when he heard it, the sound that had been haunting his nightmares for the past 3 years. Horses, moving fast across hard ground, their hoofbeats creating that distinctive rhythm that spoke of riders with urgent business. He set down the plate and moved to the window, parting the curtain just enough to peer out into the gathering dusk. What he saw made his mouth go dry. Riders, perhaps 20 of them, spread out in a loose line about half a mile from his cabin. Even in the dim light, he could make out the distinctive silhouettes of Paiute warriors. Their hair loose and flowing, their horses small and quick, their weapons a mixture of traditional bows and modern firearms acquired through trade or warfare. They weren't attacking, not yet. They were waiting, and that was somehow worse than an immediate assault.
It meant they were organized, disciplined, and confident enough in their position to take their time. Cordell moved away from the window and found Ayanna watching him with those penetrating dark eyes. "They came for me," she said, quietly. "How many?" he asked, though he was already checking his rifle and counting the cartridges in his gun belt. "Enough," was all she said. The standoff stretched through the night like a taut wire ready to snap. Cordell had reinforced his cabin as best he could, moving furniture against the windows and checking his ammunition supply. 37 rounds for his Winchester, 18 for his Colt, and a shotgun with buck and ball loads that would be devastating at close range but useless beyond 50 yards. Against 20 warriors, it might last him 10 minutes if he was lucky. Ayanna had insisted on sitting up despite her wound, positioning herself near the window where she could observe her people's movements. There was something in her posture, a tension that went beyond physical pain, that told Cordell she was wrestling with decisions that went far beyond their immediate predicament. "They're not just here for you," he said, more statement than question. She turned to look at him, and in the lamplight her face seemed carved from desert stone. "No, they're here because of what my rescue might mean." "Explain that to me." Ayanna was quiet for so long that Cordell thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone forced to reveal truths she'd rather keep hidden. 3 days ago, my father met with representatives from the territorial government. They offered a treaty, land for my people in exchange for peace. Good land, near the lake, with rights to fish and hunt. Cordell felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. But something went wrong. The miners complained. They said Paiute presence near the silver claims would discourage investment, make the territory appear dangerous to Eastern money. Ayanna's laugh held no humor. So the government changed the terms. Instead of Walker Lake, they offered us a reservation in the desert, land where nothing grows, where there are no streams, where our children would starve within 2 seasons. And your father's response? He told them he would consider their offer, but privately he began preparing for war. Ayanna touched her wounded shoulder gingerly. "I was sent to scout the mining camps, to assess their defenses and count their numbers. It was meant to be the last reconnaissance before my father decided whether to accept the reservation or fight for our homeland." Cordell understood now why the warriors outside weren't simply demanding her return. If Chief Winnemucca believed his daughter had been captured or killed while on a crucial mission, it would be the final insult that pushed him toward open warfare. "Your father doesn't know you're alive?" "Not unless he sent those warriors to find my body." Ayanna moved to peer through a crack in the shutters. "But they're not acting like a burial party. They're too organized, too patient. This feels like something else." As summoned by her words, a voice called out from the darkness, strong, clear, and speaking English with the careful precision of a man who had learned diplomacy the hard way. "Jack Cordell, I am Natchez, war chief of the Northern Paiute. We would speak with you." Cordell felt Ayanna stiffen beside him. "Natchez," she whispered, "my father's brother." "That good or bad for us?" "He's the one who wanted war from the beginning. He believes treaties with whites are just lies written on paper." Cordell moved to the door, but didn't open it. "I'm listening, Natchez. You have something that belongs to us. Return her, and you may live to see another sunrise." "She's hurt bad," Cordell called back. "Needs medical attention before she can travel." "Then we will take her to our medicine man." Ayanna grabbed Cordell's arm. "If I go with them now, wounded and having failed in my mission, Natchez will use it to convince my father that negotiation is impossible. He'll say the whites shot me down like a dog, that only blood can wash away the insult. And if you don't go, he'll assume you're holding me captive or that I've turned traitor to my people. Either way, it ends in war." Cordell studied her face in the lamplight. seeing something there that reminded him why he'd never married, never settled down in one place long enough to grow roots. "There's a third option," he said slowly, "which is, we tell them the truth, all of it." Ayana shook her head. "Natchez won't believe that a white man helped me without expecting something in return. In his experience, whites only show kindness when they want something valuable in exchange." Then maybe it's time his experience got updated. Before Ayana could protest, Cordell opened the door and stepped onto his porch. 20 warriors materialized from the darkness like smoke given form. Their weapons trained on him with the casual precision of men who killed for a living. In the center of the group sat a man who could only be Natchez. Tall, lean, with the kind of presence that made other men step aside without being asked. "I'm Jack Cordell," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Your niece is inside, wounded but alive. She needs rest and care before she can travel. You claim to care for the health of a Paiute woman?" Natchez's voice held skepticism sharp as a blade. "Why would a white man risk his life for one of our people?" It was the same question Ayana had asked, and Cordell found himself giving the same answer. Because it was the right thing to do. Natchez urged his horse forward, stopping just outside easy rifle range. The right thing. "Tell me, Jack Cordell, what do you know about right things? Do you know that your people promised my sister's son a scholarship to their school in California, then withdrew it when they learned he was Indian? Do you know that your territorial government promised us supplies for the winter, then delivered blankets infected with smallpox?" Each accusation hit like a physical blow, and Cordell felt the weight of his people's broken promises settling on his shoulders. He'd seen enough of frontier justice to know that most whites viewed Indians as obstacles to be removed rather than people to be respected. "I know my people have done wrong," he said finally. "I know there's blood on both sides, and I know most of it didn't need to be spilled. But I also know that your niece was dying when I found her, and I couldn't ride away from that." Even knowing it might cost you your life? Even knowing that. Natchez studied him for a long moment, and Cordell could feel the weight of 20 warriors' attention focused on him like sunlight through a magnifying glass. In the silence, he heard the soft sound of the cabin door opening behind him. Ayana stepped onto the porch, moving carefully but under her own power. Her shoulder was tightly bandaged, and her face was pale with pain, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "Uncle, this man saved my life and asked for nothing in return. He treated my wounds with his own hands and gave me his own bed. He has shown more honor than many of our enemies, and more wisdom than some of our friends." Natchez's attention shifted to his niece, and Cordell saw something complex pass between them. Family loyalty warring with political necessity, personal affection struggling against tribal duty. "Ayana, daughter of my brother, you were sent to gather information about our enemies. What did you learn?" "I learned that the mining camps are poorly defended, and their men are afraid of shadows. I learned that the territorial government's promises are worth less than sagebrush in a windstorm. But I also learned that there are still white men who believe in honor, even when honoring it costs them dearly." She gestured toward Cordell. "This man could have left me to die and avoided all trouble. He could have turned me over to the soldiers and claimed a reward. Instead, he risked everything to save a stranger. If we're to judge all whites by their worst examples, shouldn't we also recognize their best?" Natchez remained silent for so long that Cordell began to wonder if the war chief was considering an attack after all.
When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of a man who had seen too much and hoped for too little. "Your father sent me to bring you home safely, Ayana. He also sent me to deliver a message to any whites we encountered." Notch's eyes fixed on Cordell with laser intensity. "But perhaps the message we should carry back is different than the one we brought." Before Cordell could ask what that meant, the sound of approaching horses reached them from the north. Not the careful, measured approach of Indian ponies, but the heavy thunder of cavalry mounts ridden hard. Cordell estimated at least 30 riders, moving fast and with purpose. The standoff was about to become significantly more complicated. The cavalry column that topped the rise north of Cordell's ranch looked like something from a military parade. Blue uniforms crisp despite the dust, sabers gleaming in the morning sun, guidons snapping in the desert wind. At their head rode a young officer whose brass buttons and spotless gloves marked him as the kind of soldier who had learned warfare from textbooks rather than experience. Lieutenant Marcus Brennan, if Cordell remembered correctly from their one previous meeting in Carson City. West Point educated, Eastern-born, and possessed of the absolute certainty that came from never having been proved wrong about anything important. The kind of officer who could turn a tense situation into a massacre without meaning to. "This is Lieutenant Brennan of the United States Army," the young officer called out, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "You are surrounded and outnumbered. Lay down your weapons and surrender the Indian prisoners." Cordell felt Ayana tense beside him. The word prisoners had just transformed her from a wounded woman seeking refuge into a hostile captive, and that change in status would justify almost any action the Army chose to take. "There are no prisoners here, Lieutenant," Cordell replied, keeping his voice level and unthreatening. "Just a wounded woman who needed medical attention. Our patrol reported shots fired 3 days ago near Walker Lake. We tracked blood and Indian sign to your property." Brennan's horse danced nervously, picking up on its rider's tension. "Standard procedure requires us to investigate any potential hostage situation involving American citizens." Natcha spoke up, his English formal but clear. "There are no hostages here, soldier. We came to escort our injured family member home." "Indians don't negotiate," Brennan said flatly. "They take what they want and kill anyone who stands in their way. Mr. Cordell, step away from the hostile and let us handle this situation." The word hostile hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. In that single term, Brennan had reduced Ayana from a chief's daughter to an enemy combatant, stripped away her humanity and reduced her to a military problem requiring a military solution. Cordell saw the moment when diplomacy died and violence became inevitable. It was in the way Natcha's hand moved toward his rifle, in the subtle shift of the Paiute warriors as they prepared for battle, in the nervous energy of the cavalry horses as their riders tightened their grips on their weapons. "Lieutenant," Cordell said carefully, "this situation isn't what it appears to be." "If you'll just listen. Mr. Cordell, you're harboring a known scout for a hostile Indian force. That makes you an accessory to acts of war against the United States government." Brennan's voice carried the absolute conviction of youth and inexperience. "Step away from the Indians immediately, or we'll consider you an enemy combatant as well." Ayana moved closer to Cordell, and he could feel the tremor in her wounded shoulder. She was in no condition for a running fight, and they all knew it. If shooting started, she would be trapped between two forces with no love for each other and very little patience for nuance. "What's it gonna be, Cordell?" Natchez called out, his voice carrying a note of grim humor. "You gonna stand with us or step aside and let the boy soldiers do their work?" It was the question Cordell had been avoiding for 3 days, ever since he'd made the decision to help a wounded stranger.
Where did his loyalties lie? With his own people, despite their flaws and failures? With abstract principles of justice and mercy? With the simple human obligation to protect those who couldn't protect themselves? The answer, when it came, surprised him with its clarity. "Lieutenant Brennan," he said, his voice carrying across the tense silence with the authority of a man who had worn a badge and faced down armed men in dusty streets from Texas to Montana. "I'm Jack Cordell, former United States Marshal, and I'm ordering you to stand down. You have no authority here, Mr. Cordell." "Maybe not official authority," Cordell agreed, "but I've got something you don't have, Lieutenant. Experience. I've seen what happens when nervous soldiers start shooting at Indians, and I've seen what happens when Indians decide they've got nothing left to lose. Neither ending is pretty, and both of them could be avoided if you just listen to reason." He took a step forward, placing himself squarely between the two armed groups. It was a position that made him vulnerable to fire from either side, but it also made his intentions unmistakably clear. "This woman was shot by your patrol 3 days ago," he continued. "She was gathering medicine plants, not scouting for raiders. I found her bleeding to death and brought her here for medical attention. Her uncle came looking for her, just like any family would. Nobody here wants a fight, except maybe you, Lieutenant." "Even if that's true," Brennan said, though his voice carried less certainty than before, "she's still a member of a hostile tribe. Military regulations require—" "Military regulations," Natchez interrupted, "written by men who never faced a Paiute warrior in combat. Tell me, boy soldier, how many of my people have you killed?" The question hung in the morning air like a challenge. Brennan's face flushed red above his pristine collar, and Cordell saw the exact moment when the young officer's pride overrode his judgment. "I don't have to justify my actions to savages," Brennan snapped. "Sergeant, prepare to—" "Belay that order." A new voice cut through the tension like a cavalry saber through silk. The man who rode up from the rear of the cavalry column wore the same blue uniform as his fellows, but everything else about him spoke of experience rather than regulation. His uniform was faded and dust-stained, his boots were worn smooth by years of hard use, and his face carried the kind of lines that came from squinting into too many desert suns. Captain William Sherman, no relation to the famous general, but a soldier who had earned his reputation the hard way, one Indian war at a time. "Captain Sherman," Brennan said, his voice carrying a note of relief mixed with irritation, "I was handling this situation according to established protocols." "I can see that, Lieutenant." Sherman's voice was dry as alkali dust. "And in about 2 minutes, you would have started a war that would cost the Army 100 good men and the territory about 1,000 civilian lives." Sherman dismounted and walked forward, his movements careful and deliberate. Unlike Brennan, he kept his hands well away from his weapons and his voice pitched low and conversational. "Jack Cordell," he said, extending his hand, "haven't seen you since that business in Tucson. You're looking well for a man standing between 2 armed camps." Cordell shook the offered hand, feeling some of the tension drain from his shoulders. Sherman was a soldier he could respect, tough, experienced, and smart enough to know that some problems couldn't be solved with bullets. "Captain, wish I could say the circumstances were better." "They usually are when you're involved." Sherman's eyes flicked to Ayanna, then to Natchez and his warriors. "Heard you found yourself a wounded Indian woman. Also heard you've been taking good care of her." "Just doing what needed doing." "Always did have a soft spot for strays and wounded critters." Sherman turned to face Natchez, his posture respectful but alert. "War Chief Natchez, isn't it? Your reputation precedes you." "As does yours, Captain Sherman. You are known among my people as a hard man, but a fair one." "I try to be both when the situation calls for it." Sherman gestured toward Ayanna. This is Chief Winnemucca's daughter, if I'm not mistaken. She is. Then this situation just got a lot more complicated than my lieutenant realized. Sherman's voice carried a warning that made Brennan shift uncomfortably in his saddle. Chief Winnemucca has been negotiating with the territorial government for weeks. If his daughter turns up dead or missing, those negotiations are going to end in a way that won't make anybody happy. The girl was scouting our positions, Brennan protested. That makes her a legitimate military target. The girl, Sherman said with deadly quiet, is the daughter of a chief who could put 500 warriors in the field if he chose to. Whether she was scouting or gathering flowers is less important than the fact that she's alive and unharmed thanks to Mr. Cordell's intervention. Sherman turned back to Cordell, and his expression carried the weight of a man who had seen too many unnecessary wars start over pride and misunderstanding. "Jack, I need to ask you straight. What's your assessment of this situation?" Cordell considered his words carefully. What he said next could determine whether the sun set on peace or war. "I think," he said slowly, "that everybody here wants the same thing. The Army wants peace in the territory. Chief Winnemucca wants security for his people. And folks like me just want to live our lives without dodging bullets every time we step outside. And you think that's possible?" "I think it's possible if men of good faith on both sides are willing to put aside their pride and work towards something better than what we've got now." Sherman nodded slowly. "Natchez, would Chief Winnemucca be willing to meet with territorial representatives, under proper conditions, with guarantees of safe conduct?" "He might," Natchez replied carefully, "if the terms were fair and the guarantees came from men of honor." "I can arrange that." Sherman's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to making decisions that shaped the lives of others. "But I'll need something from both sides. Lieutenant Brennan, you and your men will escort Mr. Cordell and Miss Ayanna to Carson City, where she can receive proper medical attention and be reunited with her father under neutral conditions." "Captain, I protest." "Your protest is noted and overruled." Sherman's voice cut through Brennan's objection like an axe through kindling. "War Chief Natchez, I'll need your word that your warriors won't interfere with our movements or conduct any raids while negotiations are ongoing." "You have it," Natchez said simply. "And Mr. Cordell," Sherman continued, "I'll need you to serve as an informal mediator during the initial talks. Both sides seem to trust you, which makes you more valuable than a company of cavalry." Cordell felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He'd come to Nevada Territory looking for peace and solitude, and instead, he'd found himself at the center of events that could determine the fate of thousands. "I'll do what I can, Captain." "I know you will." Sherman remounted his horse and gathered his reins. "Gentlemen, we have a long ride ahead of us. Let's make sure we all arrive in Carson City with our scalps intact and our consciences clear." As the combined group prepared to move out, Ayanna moved close to Cordell's side. "You could have walked away from this," she said quietly. "Even now, you could claim you were just helping an injured stranger and let others handle the consequences." "Could have," Cordell agreed. "But sometimes a man has to see things through to the end, especially when he helped set them in motion." "And what do you think the end will be?" Cordell looked at the mixed group of soldiers and warriors preparing for the journey to Carson City, enemies who had agreed to ride together toward an uncertain future, united by nothing more than a shared hope that violence wasn't the only solution to their differences. "I think," he said finally, "that we're about to find out whether there's enough honor left in this territory to build something better than what we're tearing down." 3 weeks later, the Winnemucca-Sherman Accord was signed in Carson City, establishing the first permanent Paiute reservation with genuine hunting and fishing rights, adequate water access, and protection from encroachment by miners and settlers. The agreement wasn't perfect, no treaty ever was, but it represented something new in the relationship between whites and Indians in Nevada Territory. Jack Cordell was present at the signing, standing beside Chief Winnemucca and Captain Sherman as they put their names to a document that would serve as a model for similar agreements throughout the West. When the ceremony was over, Ayanna found him on the steps of the territorial building. "My father has asked me to give you this," she said, offering him a small pouch made from soft doeskin and decorated with intricate beadwork. "What is it?" "Paiute custom requires that a debt of honor be repaid. You saved my life, and through that action helped save my people from a war we could not have won. This contains sacred earth from our most holy places. It means you will always have a home among the northern Paiute for as long as the mountains stand and the water flows." Cordell accepted the gift with the solemnity it deserved. "Your people don't owe me anything, Ayanna. What I did, any decent man would have done." "Perhaps," she said, her dark eyes holding that same fierce intelligence he remembered from their first meeting. "But not every man would have seen it through to the end. Not every man would have risked his standing with his own people to ensure justice for strangers." As Cordell rode south toward his ranch that evening, the sacred earth safe in his saddlebags, he reflected on the chain of events that had started with a woman's cry in the desert and ended with the hope of lasting peace. Sometimes, he thought, the most important moments in a man's life weren't the ones he planned for. They were the ones that found him when he was just trying to do the right thing. The desert stretched out before him, vast and unforgiving as always, but somehow it seemed less lonely than it had 3 weeks ago. He had made a difference, not through violence or force, but through the simple recognition that some things worth fighting for, even when fighting meant standing still and refusing to let others define what was right and wrong. The sun was setting behind the mountains when he reached his ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded him of the beadwork on Ayanna's gift. Tomorrow there would be cattle to tend and fences to mend, the simple work of a man building something lasting in a harsh land. But tonight, for the first time in years, Jack Cordell slept peacefully, knowing that sometimes the right choice was also the smart choice, and that honor wasn't just an abstract concept, but a living thing that could change the world one decision at a time.